Hi, my name is Keun-Sik Kang. I'm Senior Manager of PricewaterhouseCoopers Korea. I've been working for 10 years so far and engaged in several development projects with other parties. With this knowledge, today I will be presenting you public-private partnerships, what we usually call PPP. Chapters are divided into two phases. First one, overview of PPP. In this chapter, you will be able to know what the PPP is and how those things work in Korea legislation. And then, in the chapter 2, we will study some cases of PPP. As there are many types of PPP, it should be good for you to know what kind of structures in detail. So, let's get started. In chapter 1, I will present you overall information on PPP. As you may see on the left side of this presentation, I will let you know definition of PPP at the very beginning, and then various types of PPP, and lastly, main structure of PPP. And then we'll see how it works in South Korea. In order to do this, we should study the legal structure in Korea for PPP and specific process for the PPP. And finally, we will see what government sector will do in PPP scheme. So here we start. What is PPPs? As you may know, public-private partnership is an agreement between government and private sector for the purpose of providing public infrastructure, community facilities, and related services. The private sector enters into a contract with government for design, delivery, and operation of the facility or infrastructure and the services provided. The private sector finances the capital investment and recoup investment over the course of the contract. The asset is transferred back to the public sector at the end of the contract. This is a very typical PPP scheme. In general, the private sector seeks to maximize efficiency and reduce costs compared to the public sector. On the other hand, government needs to invest on various infrastructures for public services, and they have to spend large scale of government budget. PPP has its significance in introduction private sector capital, technology, and management know-how for the expansion and operational of social infrastructure such as roads, railways, schools, and sewage facilities, which has traditionally been the role of the government. So in this slide, I'd like to talk about type of PPP. Basically, PPP is contract between public sector and private sector. Therefore, based on what kind of contract is, there are various types of PPP can be generated. Generally, PPP is divided into several categories based on when the right of operation and ownership is transferred back to public. Here I wrote 4 boxes that stands for the typical contract model when it comes to PPP: BOT, MBTO, BOO, and BTL. It looks very similar. However, from the private sector point of view, different type of PPP affects very strongly to them. First one, BOT is the most popular one. In this scheme, during the concession period, private sector will have ownership and operational rights. When the period comes to the end, the ownership and operational rights will be transferred back to public. BTO is very similar to BOT. However, the ownership will be transferred back to public right after the completion of construction of the project. Private sector will have operational rights during the concession period, and when the period comes to the end, the right for the operation shall be terminated. As the ownership is related to legal and tax issues and the scope of work for the private sector during the concession period, each party considers several things before PPP actually begins. And there is a case of BOO that ownership and operation fully belong to private sector. And last one, BTL, is PPP that public will pay for lease to private sector. In order to establish this scheme, public will have ownership and conduct operation with taking all risk by themselves. These BTL types usually are executed on the low demand and revenue project, such as educational sector and private sector. Private will enjoy stable lease revenue is because private will not participate without reasonable financial results. So to the next slide, let's see those PPP types in ownership and role point of view. If public sector has 100% ownership and has a contract for service or of management with private sector, the public sector plays the role of provider. On the other hand, under the PPP scheme, the private sector plays the role of provider and public sector will be an enabler or regulator. For example, in the BTL scheme, the public sector borrows infrastructure built by the private sector. Substantially, it results in the same effect as financing from the private sector. In the middle of the page, the PFI means private finance initiative, and the role of financing is done by private sector. On the other hand, in the BOT scheme, because the private sector is in charge of construction and direct operation for a certain period of time, the level of delegation or risk increases. In other words, in the PPP structure, it is very important to find the balance point between business risks of the private sector and the benefit of the public sector. Next slide shows a typical SPV structure for PPP. Private partner from the definition of PPP will play an important role for conducting the projects. Let's think about project itself. There should be someone who invests money into the project with various methods. And there also should be someone who will utilize the money in order to construct the facilities. And when the construction finalized, there should be someone who will operate the projects. As such, in order to start this PPP project, many of stakeholders will be involved with various ways. Since its complication, generally, private sector establishes SPV, special purpose vehicle, in order to gather all of roles and responsible parties in the one stakes. This SPV can be composed of entitled who can perform various roles such as construction, financing, operations, rehabilitation, and maintenance, etc. Or it can be composed with few numbers of core entities such as operator and serves other necessary roles through separate contracts. This is a very basic structure, and the structure of the SPV can be different depending on the content and structure of each project. As I shall explain later, the financial institution that provide loans will require various safety nets to ensure stable return on their loans. This is one of the most important elements for the private and public sector to agree on this PPP contract. You may raise question of what kind of projects will be under this complicated PPP structure. As you imagine, most of the projects are large scale with huge amount of investment. If the project is not that big, then PPP is not needed, as one single party may conduct everything. So this basic knowledge, many people think that only greenfield project is applicable for PPP. And yes, that is partially correct, as most of projects of PPP are greenfield, the new projects. However, PPP can also be applied to brownfields such as urban renewal or port facilities innovation, or of course, in this case, the investment scale is smaller compared to greenfield and the risk is relatively low. So when someone wants to promote the PPP project, then he or she should think both sides. As discussed in legislative assessment, a government may decide to enact a PPP law or a concession law for a number of reasons, such as to give priority to a process of developing, procuring, and reviewing PPP projects that will take priority over sector laws, or to establish a clear institutional framework for developing, procuring, and implementing PPPs. PPP laws can also be used to close gaps in the law of host country may need to allow for successful infrastructure PPP projects, such as enabling the grant of spending right to lenders and requiring open and fair procurement processes. These modifications may be embedded in sector-specific law, or in the case of procurement or competition law, or that can be included in general concession or PPP law. Under this point of view, most of countries establish PPP law for each country. And yes, South Korea also established Act on Public-Private Partnership in Infrastructure. Let's begin with history of PPP legislation in Korea. In Korea, the Private Capital Inducement Promoting Act for PPP was enacted in 1994. Since then, the act has been revised to the Act on Private Participation in Infrastructure in 1998. The key feature of this revision is that it have established a system such as risk sharing and minimum revenue guarantee to facilitate private investment in SOC. In 2005, there was another amendment, including introduction of BTL scheme, expansion of facility types, diversification of investor profiles such as infrastructure funds. As you know, Korea's private investment system has been steadily upgraded, and this system has enabled us to secure various infrastructure effectively. To the next page. This slide is about the structure of PPP legislation. PPP-related act and enforcement decree in Korea prescribes among 48 eligible facility types and suggests BOO, BTL, BOT, BOO, etc. as the implementation methods. Also, it prescribes implementation procedure, infrastructure credit guarantee fund, infrastructure fund, government support and risk-sharing measures, etc. In other words, PPP-related act and the enforcement decree comprehensively regulate private sector projects, and the bank plans for PPP established by the Ministry of Strategy and Finance presents general policy directions. In addition, it helps to raise transparency of project implementation by regional decision-making for PPP project selection and implementation terms through feasibility and qualification check, and also by selecting private partners through competition. The next slide is about eligible facility types on PPP in Korea. The PPP Act in Korea designated 48 types of infrastructure facilities in 15 sectors. The largest sector is culture and tourism. This sector includes development of tourist complexes and variety tourism, leisure, and culture facilities. In addition, the PPP Act includes general SOC facilities such as road, rail, port, and airport, and it also includes residential facilities such as military housing and public housing. Each sector applies different PPP type or system. However, SOC infrastructure and energy sector that generally operates commercially use BTO system in general. And the BTL system is mostly used for areas that requires public operation, such as residential facilities, educational, etc., as I mentioned before. In the next page, this page shows most general case for stakeholders in PPP public in Korea. This is similar to the typical SPV structure for PPP that you have seen previously. Construction and operation companies and financial institutions establish SPC for the project, and the government grants operational rights to the SPC. The SPC will be responsible for financing, construction, and operation, and will transfer ownership to the government when the concession period comes to the end. Of course, SPC may consign some operations and maintenance to professional companies. When there is no PPP scheme, most of the contract between the government and private sector was merely maintenance and operational contract for conducting some projects. However, as this PPP scheme is established, the role of the private sector expanded to financial procurement and operation. In this slide is about typical implementation method of PPP. First one is BTO. The BTO consists of 3 steps. First step is construction by the private sector. Second one is ownership transfer to the government upon completion of construction. And third one is operation by the private sector. In this type of PPP, IRR and profitability indicator is determined, generally around 8% to 15% through negotiation between stakeholders. Next one is BTL. The BTL also consists of these steps too. First step is construction by the private sector. Second step is ownership transfer to government. Third step is lease and payment by the government to the private sector. Unlike the BTL is structured for government to lease and use facilities, so the IRR is determined by adding a fixed number of percentage to the interest rate of government bonds, not likely the BTO. Recently, due to various inconveniences caused by the early stage ownership transfer, BOT and BLT are more used instead of BTO and BTL. However, method of PPP may be applied differently depending on the structure, contents, and the purpose of each project. The next slide is about compare and contrast of BTO versus BTL. First, the fundamental difference between BTO and BTL is profitable type or lease type. BTO, which is a profitable type, the private sector takes demand risk. On the other hand, the BTL, which is a lease type, the government is responsible for the operation and there is no demand risk for private sector. In the end, the selection criteria of those 2 types can be considered whether it's possible to operate commercially. For example, road, rail, and port, which can fully commercialized, are covered by the BTO type. On the other hand, schools, welfare, medical, culture facilities, which is not possible commercial operation, are covered by the BTL type. Therefore, while BTL type is done by solicit projects only, BTO is applicable not only in solicit projects but also in unsolicited projects by private sector proposal. Let's take a look a little bit deeper on the PPP. It is about the implementation process. First, the competent authority reviews the value as PPP projects. This review process is conducted through a specialized organization called the Public and Private Infrastructure Investment Management Center, PMAC, in the Korea Development Institute. If the conclusion VFM test shows its eligibility, the competent authority will design the project and announce the RFP for bidding. After that, they select the preferred bidder through the bidding process and finally designated the consignor through negotiation. The Ministry of Strategy and Finance, which manages the PPP policy, has set up the PPP review committee, and this committee is responsible for reviewing and approving each major process in PPP. Perhaps, I think that PPP process is made in your country in a similar way. Let's look at the details of implementation process. The processes of implementation for PPP is slightly different on condition that the projects are solicit or unsolicited. First of all, solicit project is similar to typical PPP implementation process shown in the previous slides. On the other hand, unsolicited project starts from the proposal of private sector. Then, the competent authority will review the proposal and if the proposal from private sector is reasonable, competent authority requests for alternative proposals. After this proposal has been adopted, it can be divided into two types of processes. First, it's in case of bidding with additional proposals. In this case, the initial proponent will participate in the bidding process in the same method as subordinate proponent. Of course, the first proponent is more advantageous because it has a better understanding of the project than the other proponents. Second, if there is no proposal from any other third party, excluding the first proponent, the competent authority will designate the final operator for them. Of course, if the initial proposal has no reason to disqualify, the initial proponent will be considered as the final operator. So the next slide shows how to select unsolicited projects. There are three criteria in high level. The first is the relevance to the umbrella national or competent authority plans. The second is the benefit cost analysis and VFM test by the PMAC of KDI. And the third is a review of the PPP review comments. First of all, the importance of these three criteria is the same. The results of the BC analysis should be bigger than 1, and the results of the VFM test should be bigger than 0. Also, according to the opinion of PMAP, it is to be required such as optimal cost, total level, fiscal support side, etc. The review by the PPP commit will be limited to about $200 million for BTO and $100 million for BTL. Unsolicited projects are likely to have been planned from the perspective of private operators. In this case, we can see that the PPP project is selected on a very strict standards. I will explain more about VFM test. As I mentioned earlier, VFM is a value that displays the efficiency of private investment over government financing in terms of cost and benefit. So if VFM bigger than 0, the project will be designated as a PPP project. On the contrary, if VFM is smaller than 0, the project will be financed by the government, fully covered by government. You can understand the point where VFM occurs through a graph in the bottom on this page. This is VFM that minimizes the construction delay or cost overrun that PPP has caused in traditional public procurement in the past. It can be a financial or non-financial fact. For reference, PMAC in Korea is evaluating VFM using its own standardized model. The second one, the next slide, is about the PPP review commit. As I mentioned before, the PPP review commit is under the Ministry of Strategy and Finance and will review only about $200 million for BTO and $100 million for BTL. PPP review commit consists of 18 commit members. Chairman is Ministry of Strategy and Finance, and members are 9 vice ministry of the ministries, and plus 8 private sector specialists. And subject to review are PPP policies such as implementation guidelines, PPP project designation, contract award, or cancellation. As a result, the PPP review commit system operates to filter out projects that omit the intent of the PPP scheme through reviewing the PPP project by a third party other than competent authority. In this slide, I would like to talk about BTL. This slide is about implementation process or solicited project on BTL. Again, this is similar to the typical PPP implementation process. But in the initial stage, there is the establishment procedure of PTL calling by the Ministry of Strategy and Finance. This is because PTL is a lease-type business. In other words, by establishing the financial limit that the government can expand through the BTL project, the government provides guidelines to private companies participating in the proposal. In this slide describes the PPP period of operation. In certain projects, the period of operation may be determined in advance by law, but generally, the period of operation is decided in the concession agreement between the competent authority and the private sector concessionaire. But the period of operation is within 50 years under the PPP guideline. Average operation period in Korea is 20 to 30 years, for example. Road is 30 years, rail is 30 years, port is 50 years, BTL is normally 20 years. However, the most important factor in deciding the concession period of operation is the possibility of returning investment by private operations. Let's look at government support from this slide. In Korea, government support is divided into financial support and risk-sharing measures. First, land acquisition. Land acquisition enables private investors to be business stability and leverage it for financing by purchasing government land with construction costs. Considering Korea's high land prices, it is very important support. Let's take a look at details about other 5 supports. First one is the construction subsidies. The government subsidies part of the total investment cost for each sector. For example, the road is less than 30% of total investment, and the rail is less than 50% of total investment. Port is less than 30% of total investment. Please note that the investment in here is limited to construction costs, not the operational cost. And second one is MRG. This is what we call minimum revenue guarantee. This system was first introduced in 1999 and was implemented only until the end of 2009. The main reason for the abolishment of the MRG system is that excessive optimistic demand forecasts have caused a lot of losses to the government's finances. Instead of this MRG system, it is introduced new risk-sharing measures in 2009. Here we start. Let's look at what the new risk-sharing structure. First is risk-sharing by the government. When the actual operation revenue is less than the designated risk-sharing revenue, government will make up the difference and pay the private sector to amount of shortfall. For example, this is the case in amount of operation revenue that guarantees the IRR comparable to the government bonds rate of return. If the actual operational revenue exceeds the risk-sharing revenue, the amount of government subsidies that have been given so far will be withdrawn. Next is risk-sharing by the private sector. Subsidies are given only when the actual operation revenue is higher than 50% of the risk-sharing revenue. In other words, the subsidy will only be paid if there is a certain level of operational performance. As a result, there is uncertainty about the IRR, and private companies are making more efforts to carry out efficient projects. The picture at this bottom illustrates these structures well. In this next slide shows to compare the new risk-sharing structure and MRG in some respects. First, the government can minimize the moral hazard of the private sector by changing the system from MRG to risk-sharing program. And second, the past MRG has a low risk, high return structure. On the other hand, the new risk sharing structure has a low risk, low return structure. This is a result of a reasonably coordinated structure that was excessively favorable to the private sector in the past. Third, the MRG shares a risk for only a portion of the total operating period. On the other hand, the new risk-sharing structure shares the risk during the entire operation period. Fourth, in terms of effectiveness, MRG has stimulated private sector participation in PPP, but it has caused moral hazard and huge default on national budget. On the other hand, the new risk-sharing structure is increasing the private sector's risk burden and mitigating greater motivation for profit by private companies. Third one is tax credit. Government serves to private operator tax credits such as exempt from acquisition and registration tax, value-added tax exemption, separate tax, and interest income from infrastructure bonds, separate taxation on the dividend income from infrastructure funds. Separate taxation has the advantages of being able to avoid progressive taxation with low applied tax rate compared to aggregate taxation. Fourth is the termination payment. If the contract is terminated during construction or operation due to inevitable reasons, the government collects management and operation rights of the facilities and make a certain amount of termination payments. This type of support system is considered very important in terms of the exit of private companies. Last one is the Infrastructure Credit Guarantee Fund. Government provide credit guarantee for consignor obtaining bank loans. For this, government set up an industry-based credit guarantee fund of support the establishment of infrastructure fund. So far, we have looked into overall definition of PPP and how it works in South Korea. You have seen history of PPP Act in Korea and some of government support changes and the reason why it has been changed. From now on, I would like to present detailed real PPP project cases for your understanding. Okay, so far we have seen some overview of PPP. In this chapter, we will talk about the detailed cases in here. So PPP case can be divided into port and non-port type. In here, we will take 3 cases of non-port type of PPP and 2 cases of port type PPP. And then we will study what kind of PPPs are implemented in past several years in Korea. In the last, we will talk about PPP prospects in Korea. Let's take a look into non-port part. The first case is the Jordan IPP3 Aman Asia Heavy Oil Thermal Power Project. Generally, the energy sector has strong demand. In particular, electricity is a necessary energy, and the government usually have a system that provides it to its own citizens directly. In the PPP of the energy sector, private companies will invest for large-scale power generation facilities, but the government will guarantee electricity purchases through the power purchase agreements, what we call PPA, thereby providing a structure for effectively returning private investment. This project was participated by representative companies of Korea, Japan, and Finland, including Korea Electric Power Corporation, Mitsubishi, and Wärtsilä. National Electric Power Corporation in Jordan signed a PPA with SPV to support financing such as loan agreement. The type of PPP was BOO, and the concession period was 25 years. Equity and loan are 25% and 75% respectively. And the capital structure is typical of infrastructure development project. The second one is the Eurasia undersea tunnel project in Turkey. Generally, roads and railways have a certain level of demand, not as much as the energy sector. In particular, in the case of undersea tunnel, it is common to make reducing the tunnel time compared to existing routes, which is a profitable business model for private operators as well as for the government. Government did not see high risk on this project, and it leads them to give MRG. It is what it called, in here, they call grant of right for the business and guaranteed minimum traffic. So, financing was very smooth because the condition was very good. This project was initiated to establish SPC with the participation of SK Group in Korea and YK Holdings in Turkey. Construction consigned to SK ENC Korean company. Maintenance consigned to EGIS, a French company, respectively. And DLH, which is in charge of transportation in Turkey, has signed an MRG contract with SPC. K-SURE, Korea's export credit agency, and KEXIM, public financial institution, have participated in the financing. The type of PPP was BOT, and the concession period was 26 years. Equity and loan were composed of 21% and 79% respectively. And the third one is the waste disposal facility business in Thailand. Do you know about waste disposal system? Recently, it is a facility that is introduced in a smart city. When you put waste into a hole of the treatment area in a house or an apartment, this waste is automatically moved to the waste collection places through a pipe connected to the underground. And technology to recycle this waste is also being introduced. It is a wonderful circulation. This project was similar to this. The W Company, a medium-sized company in Korea, established SPC with Korea Bank and conducted project on construction waste disposal and recycling facilities. Recycled compost and plastic material are sold to farmers and Federation, Thailand, and POSCO plant, respectively. SPC can recover the investment cost through the sales of the recycled product, which was guaranteed by contract. The type of PPP was BOT, and the concession period was 26 years. Equity and loan were composed of 13% and 87% respectively. Next two projects are PPP cases in the port sector. First is Malaysian Penang Terminal Phase 2 project. This project was construction and operation of a terminal equipped with an ethylene propylene refrigeration gas tank facility packages, refinery and petrochemical storage facilities in Penang, Johor Province in Malaysia. In other words, this was a project to build and operate a port terminal specialized in oil and gas sector. The SPC for this project had a 10% equity from the local government of Malaysia. This is often the case in the PPP project. Equity participation by the public sector has advantages of strengthening the credibility of SPCs and being able to monitor construction and operation more effectively. In addition, this project was in the form of AP contract, which guaranteed the private sector revenue from the public sector regardless of demand. In other words, this is the same effect as guaranteeing the minimum revenue. Perhaps because the oil and gas sector is usually settled in the demand, the government saw this has less burden on AP contracts. The type of PPP was BOT, and the concession period was 25 years. Equity and loan were composed of 19% and 81% respectively. The last is the Jamaica Kingston Freeport Terminal project. Kingston Port is a major container ship line port in the Caribbean region. This was a project to privatize, expand, improve, operate, and maintenance existing Kingston container terminals. This project was a typical port container terminal development project, not a new development, but an existing port renewal project. As a result, China Merchant Holdings, a Chinese terminal operator, and CMA CGM, a French shipping liner who used the port in the past and to be expected to use port in the future, has invested nearly each 50% to establish SPC. There was no government guarantee such as MRG or AP in this project. It was probably because there was already enough cargo volume as existing port. This means that financing has been smooth without government guarantees. In addition, unlike the other PPP projects, this project had a 50-50 ratio of equities and loans. It is thought to be due to the fact that real operators and users are participated as an investor. Of course, we know that both companies have sufficient funds. The type of PPP was BROT, build, rehabilitate, operate, transfer, and the concession period was 30 years. Next, I will talk about the PPP performance highlights major projects in Korea. First one is the status of PPP projects in Korea. Since the introduction in 1995, the privately funded project has been pursued, and the contract of $94.7 billion USD has been concluded as of December 2019. As I mentioned before, the BTL project, which started in 2005, the period of the project varies according to the size of the project, so the size of the agreement by year does not form a certain pattern. Throughout the development of the system, construction subsidies were greatly reduced compared to the earlier private investment projects. Also, as noted before, minimum operation income guarantee has been abolished since 2006. A cumulative number of 753 PPP projects have been implemented, and among these projects, BTO has accounted for 33% and BTL has 67%. Also, among these projects, 676 projects are in operation and 33 projects are under construction. In terms of value, private investment is about 94.7 billion USD and subsidy is about 23.6 billion USD. Therefore, total investment amount shows 118.3 billion USD. Please compare this with your country. Let's look at PPP performance by sector. This data is a little bit outdated, but as of 2009, road and rail sector accounts about 80% of the port sector account for about 12% in BTO. In case of BTL, 37% is educational facilities and 28% is environmental facilities, and they takes up major proportion. These statistics, of course, have remained to these days. Next is a brief overview of major PPP projects in Korea. First one is Incheon International Airport Expressway. They have constructed expressway for about 40 kilometers through PPP method, and currently private companies operate this road and receive toll fees. The concession period was 30 years and the estimated IRR was 9.7%. Second one on the bottom is the Incheon Bridge. Incheon Bridge is a large bridge connecting Incheon, Sangdo, and Yeongjong Island, where Incheon Airport is located. You may have passed it when you came to Seoul from Incheon Airport. Also, this bridge is operated by private companies with tolls. The estimated IRR was 8.5% and the construction period in the concession period was 30 years. Third one, Metro Subway, line number 9, is the only subway line in Seoul that is constructed and operated by the private sector. This line has high demand because it connects Seoul from the west to the east and passes through Gangnam, the core of the Seoul. The estimated IRR was 8.9% and the concession period was 30%. Mercury and Global Infrastructure Fund is a shareholder in this line. Fourth case is landfill gas power plant at Sukkwon landfill site. This was the case that PPP was applied to the energy field project. This project was planned to construct and operate a power plant using gas generated from a landfill, which was very meaningful in terms of environment. In particular, various eco-friendly facilities were supported by the government. The estimated IRR was 8.4% and the concession period was 11 years, a little short compared to the other PPP projects. There was other BTO types of PPPs in housing, education area. I wrote this for your references. It's almost the last step. This slide is about key success factors of PPP projects in Korea. First is a solid legal framework of international standards. This means clear and consistent implementation procedure regulated by the PPP Act and implementation guidelines and no discrimination between domestic and foreign investor. Second one is strong government commitment to support the PPP. For success of PPP, it requires construction subsidy, MRZ, risk-sharing measures, etc. that I already mentioned earlier, and technical assistance provided by professional entities such as PMAC in Korea. Also, review of RFPs and PPP contracts, assistance in project evaluation and negotiation research for PPP policies and guidelines, etc. should be systemically accomplished. The next slide is about maintaining the role of PPP. Fiscal resources are limited due to increased spending in welfare and the government effort to expand Korea's future growth engines. Private investment will continue to complement the government's limited fiscal resources in public infrastructure investment. From this perspective, priority of BTO project is based on economic viability, PPP feasibility, and the potential to elevate infrastructure bottlenecks, etc. For example, roads with PPP is applied in these most congested areas. Also, in case of BTL, end user benefit is increased by providing necessary infrastructure in a timely fashion. This is the case. Direction of PPP continued since it was first made. The next slide is about fiscal management rule. There is 2% limit rule in Korea. 2% limit rule is limited to 2% of the total estimated annual expenditure. And this rule allows flexible fiscal management without placing heavy burden on government expenditure. At this point, government expenditure means lease payment for BTL projects, construction subsidy, and minimum revenue guarantee, etc. Up to now, Korean annual expenditure on PPP has never exceeded 2% of the government's total annual budget. No one knows how they come up with the 2% limit criteria. However, we guess that is from considering general results of the VFM assessment of PPP projects. Last two slides are about how to share PPP business experience between your country and Korea. Infrastructure development is essential for strong, sustainable and balanced economic growth, and this will be the same for every country. So we need to make good use of PPP because, as I have emphasized today, PPP has its greatest value for money because it is possible to supply the necessary infrastructure in a timely manner in the highest construction quality. So if we have the opportunity in the future, we are committed to share our PPP knowledge, experience, and best practice with your country's economies by engaging in cooperative activities such as joint research initiative, mutually beneficial support programs, regional cooperation initiative, etc. The last slide is about bilateral cooperation. Many developing economies are considering PPP as a powerful alternative to traditional procurement of infrastructure such as energy, water supply, ICT facilities, etc. However, it is difficult to attract private investment when the government lacks fully developed policy and legal framework and adequate experiences in project development and management system. Therefore, the government should not only accumulate experience in PPP, but also advance relevant policies and to improve law regulation system. And another important point is customizing to each of our partner country needs. This is to ensure that every one of our partner country successfully launches a set of PPP policies tailored to their market-specific needs. I believe that Korea's experience in PPP projects and various studies can be helpful to our partner countries. Okay, so far I have presented overall definition and characteristics of PPP and how it works in Korea with specific case studies. I hope this lecture helps you to understand PPP. If you have come up with any questions regarding this, as you can see on this screen, please feel free to contact me. I will be happily respond to your questions. Thanks for listening. Thank you.